Hello and welcome to earlymusicsources.com. My name is Elam Motem, and today, with the help of Lisandro, Tim, Jacob and Ori, we will revisit the famous yet confusing text of Giulio Caccini and perform extracts from one of his songs. The preface to Caccini's 1602 Le Nuove Musiche is a fascinating document, both from the perspective of music history and of performance practice. In this episode, we will look into specific elements that Caccini considers to be essential to good performance. In addition, we will compare a piece from his publication with an older, unornamented manuscript version, discussing the changes that Caccini made in order to bring the performance closer to what he considered to be graceful singing. Let's start. In the lengthy preface to his collection of pieces for voice and continuo, Caccini tries to present himself as the sole inventor of a new style of solo singing. We know now that his account is rather exaggerated, and that Caccini was one of several figures, such as Emilio de Cavalieri, Jacopo Peri, and many others who were attempting to reform musical practice. Caccini's version of the story was most likely fabricated in order to increase his fame, both in his own time and beyond. Retrospectively, we can say that he was rather successful. Throughout the 20th century, Caccini has been honored by scholars with titles such as the founder of the so-called Bel Canto era, the first composer of monodies, an epoch-making figure, and inventor of a new style of song. All these statements are now known to be either exaggerations or just plain wrong. Moving away from titles Caccini may or may not have deserved, in the preface, Caccini also assumes the role of singing teacher. He shares with the readers his opinions and insights concerning the way in which singers can best express the meaning of the text and move the affetti, or passions, of the listeners. This seems to have been Caccini's main concern. In fact, he mentions the concept of affetti almost 30 times. At that time, pieces were commonly conceived and circulated without written-out ornaments. The performers, according to their taste and abilities, were expected to add various ornamental figures themselves. In fact, Caccini tells us that the main reason for printing his songs was because so many people were performing his pieces in ways that he did not like. They used too many diminutions and put them in all sorts of inappropriate places. In order to minimize the discrepancy between his intentions and the performance, Caccini tries to notate everything that was possible to notate in his publication. This includes diminutions, as well as ornaments of different kinds that, according to him, should only be added in, the appropriate places, in order to better express the text. But what about further ornamental effects that are much more challenging to notate, such as little trills and subtle changes in dynamics? Ideally, these should be demonstrated live, but attempts can be made to describe them in text. This is what Caccini is trying to do in his preface. But aside from the fact that it is simply very hard to describe these effects without demonstrating them, his use of language itself is rather confusing. As such, the exact nature of these ornaments has been debated for centuries. With the help of a new translation made by Lisandro Abadi in preparation for this episode, we will try to revisit some of the more difficult terms that Caccini discusses. Intonazione, esclamazione, trillo, gruppo, and last but not least, sprezzatura. The new translation is of course available on our website. Check it out. When trying to explain these performance elements, which are a bit more difficult to describe, Caccini starts at the beginning, with the intonazione, the way one may begin a piece or a phrase. He identifies two ways of doing this. The first involves starting a third below the written note. Caccini doesn't like this very much, because, according to him, it is generally overused and may create unwanted dissonances. Furthermore, some singers apparently stayed too long on the lowest note, causing an even more unpleasant effect. All these practices are verified in other contemporaneous manuals on singing. Unlike Caccini, some of these also offer the possibility to start a fourth lower in order to fit the harmony if needed. And most confirm the prolongation of the lower note as a means of making the ornament more graceful. Caccini, however, suggests that the singer should only do this rarely, and proposes a second way of beginning a piece or a phrase which the singer should use more often. Simply starting on the written note, but with a gradual crescendo. This, according to Caccini, is the more graceful way of beginning a note. He adds, however, that doing just the opposite, starting with a decrescendo, might be an even more expressive way to begin. This brings us to the next effect, the esclamazione. Caccini explains that not all ornaments are appropriate for every musical genre. He describes the following ornaments or effects which are specifically to be used in musiche affettuose, affective or expressive pieces. Vocal crescendos and decrescendos, esclamazioni, trilli and gruppi. He refers to these as the treasures of this art. Among these, Caccini's description of the esclamazione is one of the most elusive, and his instructions have been interpreted and translated in a variety of different and sometimes contradictory ways since the 17th century. After reading and rereading the text, our understanding is that the esclamazione may be used on notes that are followed by a lower, shorter note, typically a dotted minim followed by a descending semiminim. It may begin by decreasing the intensity of the voice, and then, at the end of the first note, making a certain quick crescendo or adding spirit to the voice in some other way before arriving at the next note. Caccini criticizes those who skip this initial decreasing of the voice and instead crescendo continuously throughout a note, since, especially in higher voices, this supposedly causes the singer to sound somewhat shrill or harsh. Caccini puts a lot of effort into attempting to explain the nature of the esclamazione in his text, describing several different variants, such as the esclamazione languida, spiritosa, and others. He emphasizes that the esclamazione is essential to moving the passions of the listeners. However, all these words, in combination with the seemingly random punctuation and vocabulary that can be interpreted in many different ways, leaves us, modern readers, really quite in the dark, feeling as if we might be missing the very secret to expressive singing. Check the footnote for a clarification of the linguistic challenges of the text, as well as possible readings of it. Later sources, such as Rognoni and Praetorius, also refer to the esclamazione. While Praetorius describes it simply as a general swelling of the voice, Rognoni seems to describe it quite similarly to Caccini, with the addition of a little tremolino as a means of adding more spirit. The trilli and gruppi are ornaments that involve quick repetitions or alternations of notes. Both ornaments are regarded by Caccini as essential to good and graceful singing. He explains that the trillo is notated in this way for didactic purposes. But due to the convoluted nature of the text, it's not entirely clear which characteristic of the ornament is supposed to be pedagogical. Is it the fact that he uses only a single pitch, whereas trilli may include more than one pitch? Or is it the steadily accelerating nature of the ornament? Different scholars have different perspectives, but regardless, due to the confusing presentation, the trillo seem to have been many different things according to Caccini. Looking at the following examples, it's not always clear when the word trillo appears as a descriptive label, accompanying an ornament that's already written out, and when it's used as a sign calling for the addition of an ornament. For example, these graceful rhythmic alterations are accompanied by the label trillo, as are these figures involving a repeated note. In his final example, the annotated version of an aria, Caccini also indicates a number of descending cadential figures that should be performed with a trillo. Furthermore, there is one place that, despite the missing label, seems to realize such a cadence, albeit a shorter one. Going back to Caccini's first example, one may speculate that these ornaments, at least in some instances, may both be used as cadential ornaments, to be applied to the tenorizans clause in the case of the trillo and the cantizans in the case of the gruppo. The trillo and gruppo are found in countless other sources, often with slight variations. Here, for example, you can see Caccini's accelerating trillo in Rugnoni's treatise, labeled as the second way, as well as a similar-looking gruppo. Caccini writes that he successfully taught the trillo to his late wife, to his current wife, and to his daughters, claiming that whoever heard them sing would be very impressed. I would personally love to have heard them perform these ornaments, since unfortunately Caccini's attempt to explain these things in print is rather confusing. Of all the terms presented so far, sprezzatura might be the one most often associated with Caccini. At the same time, it's not really clear what it means. Let's see. The term was mentioned, probably for the first time, in Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, published in 1528, in which he describes how it is necessary for a graceful courtier to practice in all things a certain sprezzatura, so as to conceal all art, and make whatever is done or said appear to be without effort, and almost without any thought about it. Caccini was probably the first author to use the term in a musical context, and interestingly, his definition seems to share very little with that of Castiglione. According to his text, the fundamental principle of sprezzatura is that it transforms regular singing into something closer to speaking, favellare in armonia. This is achieved firstly by compositional means. Jacopo Peri, in the preface to his Euridice, arguably the earliest published opera, describes how speaking in song might be achieved by harmonizing certain notes, allowing the singing to continue, even on dissonant notes, until harmonizing again with consonances. Such a compositional style demands new contrapuntal licenses. While combining fast notes in one voice with slow notes in another is nothing new, this technique of speaking in music is special, since it requires putting new syllables on each note. Apart from the fact that 8th notes, let alone 16th notes, were not normally set syllabically, it makes each note more important contrapuntally, thus accentuating the otherwise passing dissonances. Caccini mentions sprezzatura on several occasions, each time connecting it to the notion of speaking in music. In some cases, like Peri, he describes permitting dissonances to pass over a sustained bass. Another element of sprezzatura that Caccini mentions is related to a certain disregard for the tactus or measure, using the term senza misura as well as variants of it. Seemingly related to this is his comment that many times the values of the notes are half as long according to the meaning of the words. However, in our opinion, this is not necessarily related to performing in a faster tempo, but to a compositional aspect, where the note values that are used for speaking in music are indeed twice as fast as the normal ones. All in all, it seems that in order to imitate declaimed speech in song, one had to practice a bit of sprezzatura or negligence, both in composition and in performance. This requires two main elements. One, a certain disregard for traditional counterpoint rules, allowing dissonances upon a firm bass note and using fast note values for text. And two, a degree of flexibility in their performance with regards to the tempo or certain rhythms. These together constituted Caccini's style canto in sprezzatura. Since the publication of Le Nuove Musiche, Caccini's sprezzatura has been interpreted in several different ways. Some projected Castiglione's definition according to their own understanding, to sing nonchalantly, or variants of this idea. Whereas some took it as permission to totally disregard the tactus and written note values. Some even understood it to be a description of tempo rubato. According to Caccini's texts, however, none of these seem to be quite right. Moving on to issues that are less elusive, things that can be more clearly notated, we will now compare two versions of Caccini's song Dolcissimo Sospiro. One from an earlier unornamented manuscript copy, and the other from his print. In the published version, Caccini went to a lot of effort to indicate everything that was possible to notate, in the hope that his style would be understood. Jacob Lawrence will sing, and Ori Harmelin will play the theorbo. According to Caccini, the most appropriate instrument to accompany a singer. Let's see. A manuscript from the end of the 16th century, known today as Brussels 704, contains 140 songs by Florentine composers, some of which are earlier versions of Caccini's songs. Mostly these are unornamented, possibly in the form that they were conceived, leaving the singer the freedom to embellish them according to their taste. Let's listen to the opening of Caccini's piece Dolcissimo Sospiro, a sweetest sigh, as it appears in the unornamented manuscript copy. Here it is compared with the version Caccini printed in 1602, which contains more details about how he wanted it to be performed. We see that he prolonged the initial note, possibly to allow more time for the intonazione, shortened the first syllable of sospiro, perhaps to make it sound more spoken, and lastly added a spicy little diminution. Let's listen. Indeed, a graceful revision. Continuing, let's return to the unornamented manuscript version. Let's turn a blind eye to the obvious parallel fifths before the cadence. As you can see, in the printed version, this contrapuntal mishap is avoided by adding a twinkly diminution, together with a slight change in the bass. In both versions, the expressive interjection de is repeated and followed by a surprising downward interval of a seventh. However, in the printed version, Caccini prolongs the first de, possibly to allow more time for some vocal effect, and the second de is shortened and preceded by a rest, perhaps in order to make it sound more spoken rather than sung, and to include a breath or a sigh. Let's listen. The other changes that Caccini implemented in his print are in a similar spirit. Little graceful ornaments added only in the places where Caccini thought it would be tasteful to add them. As a general rule, Caccini objected to long diminutions, although he did allow them on stressed long syllables, which serves to complement rather than distort the natural rhythm of the language. In fact, most of Caccini's pieces end with an impressive, graceful, and virtuosic diminution. Let's hear the unornamented ending of this piece. And now with Caccini's very graceful diminution, which is made according to his guidelines, on a stressed and long syllable. Caccini has often wrongly been credited for many things, both by himself and by others. But his importance, influence, and musical grace are undeniable. The performance instructions he published along with his music are quite unprecedented in their precision, and his work has been widely quoted by important writers on singing from the early 17th century until today. This was our episode about Caccini. We hope you enjoyed it. Many thanks to Lisandro and team for writing the episode with me, to Jacob and Ori for their performance, and to Vincent Flukigel for the lovely caricature of Caccini. Don't forget to check the special page on our website with all the footnotes and other extra information. If you enjoy Early Music Sources, feel free to support us on Patreon. Comment, share, and like. See you next time at earlymusicsources.com.
Forse vola in sen ad altro basically every game. I'm sorry.
Just one.